Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Michael Noland here. Tonight my assessment on the Beatles' fourth album, Beatles For Sale. Okay, before we get started, a real quick thank you, a very big thank you to all of our viewers. It's through you sharing our videos that the channel has achieved over 20,000 views. For a channel our size, that's excellent. We are closing in on our first 200 subscribers, and as of tonight, we have 194 subscribers, 6 shy of 200, and that's wonderful. And of course, a great big shout out to our newest subscriber, Albert Woods. Welcome to the tribe, Albert. Of course, if you enjoy the content on the channel, we encourage everybody to subscribe. All you have to do is hit that subscribe to the tribe button and then hit that top bell notification and you'll be notified of all future videos. Now, back to my assessment of the Beatles' fourth album, a necessary album, Beatles For Sale. Alright, so as you know, in the last 3 videos, I've covered the first 3 albums by the Beatles. That, of course, is Please Please Me, with the Beatles, and their magnificent A Hard Day's Night. And, of course, as a natural progression, tonight we're going to cover their fourth album, Beatles For Sale. Now, while it's true that many people, many Beatle fans, consider Beatles For Sale the weakest of all the Beatle albums, an assessment that I don't agree with, by the way. I do have to say that I was 10 years old when I first heard this album. Now, I was aware of the Beatles, of course, but at that age I was still more concerned with playing Army and collecting empty bottles so that I could buy my comic books. I was happy. But I did enjoy the Beatles' music when I listened to the radio, and of course it was that year that I got my very first guitar. And so when my friend Ozzy and I met up at another friend's house, Ozzy brought over the Beatles For Sale and the Beatles' Help album. Now, I remember clearly being impressed with Help. This was a new kind of music. This was moving forward. But I gotta say, when we got to the Beatles For Sale album, the second album he shared, quite on purpose, I'm sure, I remember being a bit confused. Where Help sounded absolutely forward, this album seemed a little bit backwards to me. Now, maybe that's because my parents were country and western musicians and singers, and I come from a family where there are a lot of guitar players and a lot of singer-songwriters. So when John Lennon was later quoted as saying that this was the Beatles' so-called country album, even at 10, I knew that wasn't true. But as confusing as the album was to my 10-year-old mind, I remember clearly liking 4 or 5 songs very much. Now, as I grew into a teenager, my musical tastes, of course, widened, like many in my generation. And I grew to understand the importance of this album. And that's a point that I want to make tonight. This isn't so much a great album as an essential album for the Beatles. Now, if you remember in my review of the Beatles' second album, With the Beatles, I identified that for me, that was the album that heralded the Beatles sound. And if you recall, I brought up information in that video about the singles that were recorded while they were recording that album. Of course, the singles were She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, neither of which were included on that album. Well, the Beatles do the same thing here with this album. During the recording of this album, they also recorded their next single, the A-side being I Feel Fine, along with the B-side, She's a Woman. And I can't help but think that if these 2 cuts were put on this album with a couple of covers removed, that this album would rank much higher in the views of your casual Beatle fan. Not only is this an excellent single, and we're going to discuss that a bit here, but I feel like this is the single that heralds what would become their greatest single, in my estimation anyway, Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, the double A side release. Now, this wasn't released like that 45 as a double A-side, but it kind of is, and let me explain why I feel that. It's true here, John won the A-side, as was his wont at that particular time in Beatle history. With Paul's She's a Woman relegated to the B-side, you would think that would be the end of that discussion. But in the United States, the B-side, She's a Woman, got so much airplay that it itself ranked number 4 on Billboard's Top 100. So why do I rank this single so high? It's not just the sales numbers, and a closer look at this single will give you a better idea of what I mean. With I Feel Fine, John introduces a pretty complicated riff based on a riff that he heard by the artist Bobby Parker on a 1961 release, Watch Your Step. And of course, the Beatles would continue to explore this riff with further singles like Ticket to Ride and Day Tripper. It's with these releases that the Beatles' influence is seen to really influence even the top echelons of rock and roll. How many singles do you remember from this 2-year period with a guitar riff-oriented song? John Lennon at one point lays claim that I Feel Fine is the very first use of feedback on a record, though he acknowledged that The Who was using feedback live in their shows, as would Jimi Hendrix. But he holds on to the claim the first intentional use of feedback on a record. Now it's curious, George Harrison later claimed that I Feel Fine was actually more of a group composition and he wasn't given credit. He said that the song's origin came from the fact that the Beatles were trying to harmonize with the song Matchbox. During the process, I Feel Fine came out of that, and once they got into the studio, George said that his contributions continued. And he said that both his and Ringo's contributions to that song were significant. And it's true, Ringo's drum pattern here, the hi-hat tom-tom duet in an almost calypso style, is quite significant. And if he's the one that developed that, it would seem to me, just based on that, he should get part of the songwriting credit, especially if he was there from the very germination of this song. Now, in my very first series covering the Beatles, which was my review of Peter Jackson's Get Back on Disney Plus, I brought up that the release date of this particular project was perfect, just before Christmas. As you know, I stated that a Christmas doesn't seem like Christmas without a Beatle release. And this single was the Beatles' second Christmas #1. Now, just as jarring as that feedback intro on I Feel Fine is John Lennon's jagged rhythm on She's a Woman. Here we see the Beatles exploring new rhythms, new riffs, all of which would define their mid-period. Now, the album was recorded in only 7 sessions over a period of 11 weeks. And of course, that's fewer sessions than any other previous Beatle album, or for that matter, any subsequent album the Beatles ever produced. And even more telling is the fact that in session 6, the Beatles recorded 8 songs during that session, 5 of which were covers. Now, here's part of my problem with the album. The Beatles seem to be retracing their steps a bit here. Instead of again producing an album by all Beatle material, they go back to the same formula that they had on their first 2 albums, and that, of course, was producing an album with 8 originals, 6 covers. Now, I don't think the Beatles went back to this formula because they wanted to. I think at this point, John was carrying the heavier burden, and Paul was still perfecting his songwriting capabilities. With John already supplying the heavy load for A Hard Day's Night, 10 songs, and Paul only offering 2 songs for the album, 3 if you include She's a Woman. All of the Beatles at this point made comments that they were totally dry on material. Paul even bringing up that they needed to get back together to start writing again. But an album was due. Remember, Brian Epstein and George Martin had put the burden of 2 albums a year on the Beatles, and it was time to record another album. So what else could they do but record what they have and fill the rest of the album with covers from their live show? Now, this worked real well in the first album, not quite as well in the second album, but in my opinion, on this album, it's the covers that the Beatles do that are the weakest points on this album. Now, Beatles For Sale hit #1, but unlike its predecessors, which charted for 30, 21, and 21 weeks, Beatles For Sale remained at #1 for 7 weeks. It regained the #1 spot for 1 week, and then later on for a further 3 weeks. But from this point on, with the exception of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Abbey Road, the Beatles would not get above 10 weeks at #1. But you have to understand, those longer periods on the charts, fewer units were moved. Now the whole world was aware of the Beatles, and they bought in mass, and they bought quickly. So weeks on the chart weren't anywhere near as important as units sold, and the Beatles were doing quite well at units sold. Now, the song that opens the album is John Lennon's No Reply. Here we see a maturation in songwriting. If you remember my review of Get Back, I mentioned Dick James. Dick James was ahead of the Beatles publishing, and it's important that Dick James even recognized at this point that John Lennon was learning to tell a story in his songs. This song, much more than any other John Lennon song before, according to Dick James, had a beginning, a middle, and an end. On I'm a Loser, we see John Lennon being influenced by Bob Dylan's style of songwriting. Indeed, it wouldn't be long before Bob Dylan's influence would even be more present in upcoming Beatle projects. Now, John said that Babies in Black was written eyeball to eyeball, so besides Paul's 2 other contributions on this album, he does have co-ownership of this song as well. Here we hear George Harrison's swelling guitar, and this was achieved by John Lennon controlling the volume on his guitar. Later, when George got very comfortable with the volume pedal, he would use this effect on his song I Need You on the Help album. The next original song on the album, of course, is one of Paul's, I'll Follow the Sun. You know, when Pete Best was interviewed one time, he recalled that Paul was constantly working on When I'm 64 and I'll Follow the Sun, back when Paul was still 16 years old. Now, the next song, 8 Days a Week, often confuses people. You see, John Lennon sings lead on this song, but the song was primarily written by Paul McCartney. According to Barry Miles' book, he got the idea while being chauffeured to John's house for another songwriting session. Evidently, he asked his driver how he was doing, and the driver replied something like, "Working 8 days a week." Immediately, this hit Paul, and this is what he delivered to John. And he already had a firm idea of the song when he finally arrived at John's house, and they both hammered out the rest of it. Here, John actually persuaded Paul to let him sing the lead on this song. Now, as far as writing credits for the next song, Every Little Thing, there's a bit of a dispute between John and Paul yet again. But this time, both writers hesitant to claim ownership of this song. Paul from the start denied being the only writer on this song, while John claiming later that it was pretty much Paul's song. I might have helped just a little bit. And you know, out of all the originals on this album, this is my least favorite as well. Now, it's interesting, the next song, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, written primarily by John, although Paul said he was in on the writing sessions for that because they were trying to develop this song for Ringo. When I read this, I started reconsidering this song, even though John Lennon is one of rock and roll's very best vocalists, that they slightly missed the mark here by not giving this song to Ringo. Of course, the last original song on the album is What You're Doing by Paul. Here we see Paul starting to polish off his style. This approach by Paul McCartney would only get better in the next album and even reach near perfection on the album following that one, Rubber Soul. So that about covers my thoughts on the Beatles For Sale. In my next video, of course, I'll be covering the album Help. Hey everybody, a quick addendum. This is after the shoot. Lights are still on, but I just want to give a big thank you to all of our listeners. You know, we do our best to provide you with quality content. Those are my notes for tonight's video. You know, I put a lot into each video and I try to do my very best research for you guys. So if you know any Beatle fans out there who would be interested in this information, please feel free to share our videos. You've all been so great at doing that. And of course, always a thumbs up is appreciated. That helps the YouTube algorithm better recognize us. And if you enjoy this kind of content, we of course encourage you to subscribe to the tribe, hit that top bell notification, and you'll be notified of all future videos. So again, this is The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland, and we'll see you in the next video.